Listen, everybody, and I will set tears pouring from your eyes. No one will rest. Poisoned arrows will strike everyone. Fevers will throw down the proud, and incurable disease will strike like lightning. For the Almighty has said, I shall wipe man whom I created off the face of the earth.
For 3 horrifying years between 1348 and 1350, the Black Death pushed medieval man to the brink of an apocalypse. The living expected only death. Everywhere, graveyards were choked with corpses.
The scale of death persuaded those who lived, weeping and lamenting through the bitter events, that the last judgment had come.
It was a world without hope, seemingly abandoned by God. From Italy to Ireland, Europe lost nearly half its population. 20 million died. In the crisis, every part of medieval society was strained to breaking point. Medicine failed the sick. Violent and macabre religious cults appeared, and morality collapsed as men turned on each other in brutal acts of cruelty. In the mid-14th century, Europe was not the dark continent so often lampooned by history. It was well populated, sophisticated, mobile, and devout.
People are moving, there are traders, there are merchants, there are pilgrims, there are soldiers, there are bureaucrats, there are people on every imaginable kind of business on the road moving about this society.
Nowhere was richer or busier with trade and commerce than the ports and cities of northern Italy. Into this medieval melting pot, in the autumn of 1347, stole a horrifying and mysterious disease. It was borne by sailors returning from the Black Sea in the east, the pestilence already in their blood and on their breath.
I have been urged to write what happened here. Every city, every settlement, every place was poisoned by the contagious pestilence. When one person had contracted the illness, he poisoned his whole family, and those preparing to bury the dead were seized by death in the same way. Thus, death entered through the windows, and as cities and towns were devastated, the survivors mourned their dead kin.
Italy was the front line of a bewildering epidemic. No one was prepared for the speed and horror of the disease. Death followed within a week from a pneumonia-like flooding of the lungs.
In a matter of 2-3 months, 20% of your population is just a pile of corpses. So being stunned, I think, is probably the most obvious reaction they must have had, as well as being petrified and having no sense of what to do to make it stop.
As people realized the disease could not be cured, they were left with only their faith in God and the efforts of the church.
When one person lay sick in a house, no one would come near. Even dear friends would hide themselves away, weeping. The physician would not visit. The priest, panic-stricken, administered the sacraments with fear and trembling. No one knew what to do.
Religion was no shield against the disease. The clergymen who braved the dying to administer their last rites often fell victim themselves. The crisis was captured by the pen of Giovanni Boccaccio. This Florentine writer now stepped forward as the Black Death's most lucid and startling witness.
Such terror was struck into the hearts of men and women by this calamity, that brother abandoned brother, and the uncle his nephew, and the sister her brother, and very often the wife her husband. But what was even worse, and quite incredible, was that fathers and mothers refused to see and tend their sick children as if they had not been theirs.
As the bonds of society fractured, the rhythms of medieval life began to unravel. Harvests went ungathered, livestock untended. In the city of Siena, civil courts were closed and building work on the cathedral halted. Work never resumed, and the great nave remains unfinished today. As local leaders died, city life stopped. The scale of the disaster was becoming clear.
In addition to lots of people being ill and dying, you now had nothing working properly. The bodies weren't being removed. Sanitation, to the extent that it existed, completely collapsed. Food wasn't being made, bread wasn't being baked. So you had, in addition to disease, famine.
Throughout the spring and summer of 1348, the toll of death went unabated. In Venice, some 90,000 died. In Florence, it was half the city's population.
Such was the multitude of corpses brought to the churches every day and every hour, that there was not enough consecrated ground to give them burial. With the cemeteries full, they were forced to dig huge trenches where they buried the bodies by their thousands.
The fear of contagion fueled a brutal response. The city authorities ordered the houses of the sick to be locked and shuttered, leaving the victims inside to die. Everyone now believed that God was punishing the world.
It's clear that the disease followed the routes of trade across Western Europe, which had become, by the 14th century, a pretty elaborate network run largely by Italians. And ironically, of course, it was from Italy that they exported very successfully the disease to other parts of Europe.
The pestilence quickly spread inland to the papal seat of Avignon. It was here, rather than in Rome, that Pope Clement VI held court. It was surely a time to hold true to one's faith. The Pope declared that prayer, piety, and religious processions were the route to salvation and survival. But they didn't work. So many were dying that the Pope ordered huge new graveyards to be consecrated to bury the piles of rotting corpses. He even consecrated the Rhone so that bodies could be dumped in the river.
In Avignon, they buried 11,000 people in 6 weeks, and they lost 1/3 of the cardinals and half the population. So clearly Avignon, as the centre or heart of Christianity, hadn't been spared.
Was the Catholic Church failing the devout? Some clearly thought so. An extraordinary movement of lay extremists now appeared. They were known as the Flagellants, and they directly challenged the authority of the Church.
We witnessed a performance of devout processions with the chanting of litanies. Men and women alike, many barefoot, others wearing hair shirts or smeared with ashes, processed with lamentations and tears. Some beat themselves with cruel whips until the blood ran.
The Flagellants marched from town to town, whipping themselves and others into a frenzy of brutal penitence. In a world seeking to appease God's fury, Christian tolerance crumbled as the community began a murderous purge. Neighbor turned on neighbor, seeking out scapegoats, heretics, outsiders, and the Jews. The Jews were accused of plots to destroy all Christendom. In the spring of 1348, Jews from Narbonne and Carcassonne were dragged from their homes and burned at the stake.
Some wretched men were found in possession of certain powders, and whether justly or unjustly, God knows, were accused of poisoning the wells, with the result that anxious men now refuse to drink the waters. Some of these men were burnt for this act and are being burnt daily, it being ordered that they should be punished thus.
Across the continent, nearly half the population was dead. England waited, proud, religious, pastoral, feudal. Once again, the Black Death entered from the sea. In the summer of 1348, it arrived in the ports of Southampton, Plymouth, and Bristol. It marched across a country where 90% of the people lived on the land. In England, servile peasants had worked their lords' estates for centuries, paying rent for their own small holdings. In the coming months, the carnage of the Black Death would transform this society in surprising ways.
Before the Black Death, life for peasants was pretty hard. They were living, large numbers of them, at a bare subsistence level. Many are living on very small holdings, scratching the existence out of the land.
Death moved slowly at first, but once the kindling was lit, the blaze spread with such intensity it looked like no one would remain. My elder brother William was one of the first in our manor to succumb to the pestilence. He died within 3 days, followed by his wife and 3 of the children.
Like those before them, the peasants believed the disease was born in corrupted air. With sweet-smelling herbs like thyme, tansy, and wormwood, they tried in vain to purify their homes. But all they did was disguise the smell of death. Gradually, the surviving peasants began to reap unforeseen advantages from death's vigor. They were in demand and could ask for higher wages and cheaper rents.
Before the Black Death, labour was plentiful, labour was cheap. After the Black Death, it was very, very difficult. You simply couldn't get people to come to do the jobs. You couldn't get people to cut your corn, to thresh it. You couldn't find people to repair your roof unless you paid them 2 or 3 or even 4 times the wages you'd paid them before.
Across the land, agricultural labourers threw off the shackles of the past. The old order of the English landscape was changing. After 3 years of terror and 20 million lives, the Black Death had reached the edges of 14th century Europe. Death's vigour would soon fade, but not before visiting one last haunting and prophetic witness. Brother John Klyn, a Franciscan friar in Ireland, believed the day of judgment had come. Struggling against the sickness that gripped him, he made one final amazing gesture.
I, Brother John Klyn of the Friars Minor of Kilkenny, have written in this book of the notable events which befell in my time, so that such deeds should not perish with time, or be lost from the memory of future generations. I leave parchment for continuing the work, in case anyone should be alive in the future, and any son of Adam can escape this pestilence and continue the work thus begun.
But the pages deliberately left blank by the dying John Klyn came to represent much more than a space on which to record the final days of humanity. For this was not the story that followed. For the surviving sons of Adam, the disease was finally waning. The war was over. Learning to live with the disease was a challenge that medieval men and women now took upon themselves. In painting and storytelling, there was an extraordinary flourishing of macabre art. Pictures in which people were encouraged to engage with the horrors of death and decay.
Art does seem to change as a result of the Black Death. The portrayal of effigies as skeletal or with worms coming out of them, a healthy woman and a skeleton right behind her. These become more common. The Black Death reminded them that it did hit everyone, that death was everyone's companion throughout their life. And that's why you get these etchings of the skeleton behind you, because that, in a sense, is the way you're thinking now. Death is your constant companion.
As Europe rebounded, millions bequeathed by the dead was spent on rebuilding. It was a time to look forward, not back.
In 1350, the Pope calls a jubilee, which encourages all pilgrims to come to Rome. So again, thousands of medieval pilgrims are on the roads. You think that would be the last thing you'd want to do after a plague, but they do. It's very regenerative.
In the narrow streets of the Italian cities, where the Black Death had first stalked, there was a gradual reawakening. For the next 100 years, Renaissance men found new pride in the classical roots of European culture. There was a huge outpouring of creativity in the fields of architecture, literature, art, and science. Ideas that celebrated the spirit of man in his world. It had been the worst century to be alive, and no other age before or since had felt so close to annihilation. But the people of medieval Europe had not lost their nerve.
One of the healthiest conclusions is to remind ourselves that Europe survived the Black Death. It survived recurring outbreaks for 300 years of plague. And I think that's a very good conclusion to get out of it, is the resilience of the human spirit in the face of this sort of appalling adversity.
Slowly, an inspiring story of human survival was emerging. From the brink of the apocalypse, a new vision of hope and humanity had been wrested from despair.